Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Iskandar, thank you very much for your very kind introductions. I didn't deserve all those things you said about me. I'm just a simple teacher. So before I start the talk, let me acknowledge that today we have among us Professor Mehdi Ha'eri Yazdi's son here in front of us, Dr. Mehdi Ha'eri Yazdi, who is actually the one who instigated this whole thing, because the book was published in Farsi many years ago, and it sort of fell into eclipse. And it was because of his commitment and persistence that now we have the book in English. So without any further ado, I will start reading, because I don't want to distract your attention by looking at the slides, so I will be more focused by reading the stuff that we've got here. So let me begin with the somber clarity that our present moment demands. As we gather here this evening at Simon Fraser University's Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, Iran is once again living through a cycle of profound political rupture. The doctrine of Velayat-e Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, once packaged as a bulwark of moral governance, has revealed its inner logic fully and without disguise. It has produced a system of absolute authoritarianism, sustained brutality, and ever-expanding economy of fear. Whatever theological elegance or metaphysical ambition its architects once claimed, the lived reality today is unmistakable. An unaccountable clerical sovereignty that has fused the spiritual vocabulary with coercive power. The current crisis is not an accident of leadership, nor merely a political deviation. It is the practical expression of a doctrine whose internal contradictions have now reached their breaking point. It is against this backdrop that Mehdi Ha'eri Yazdi's Wisdom and Governance, Hikmat and Hukumat, becomes not only intellectually compelling, but morally urgent. This is a text written in the 1990s, but its concerns are startlingly contemporary. It addresses with philosophical precision and profound internal commitment the very questions that lie at the heart of Iran's unraveling. What is legitimate authority? What is the proper relationship between religious guidance and political command? And how should a society grounded in Islamic metaphysics articulate the boundaries of coercive power? In opening our conversation with the current Iranian crisis, I want to signal something important, that the ideas we will discuss are not abstractions floating above history. They are ideas with consequences, ideas that shape institutions, structure authority, and determine the horizon of political possibility. Ha'eri Yazdi wrote this book in a moment when the Islamic Republic was still consolidating itself, its contradictions not yet fully exposed. But he saw with clarity and courage the philosophical incoherence at its core. And he insisted that the language of Islamic philosophy itself, far from supporting authoritarian guardianship, contains the intellectual resources to critique, limit, and ultimately reject it. Tonight I want to walk through the conceptual architecture of wisdom and governance, but to do so in a way that situates it within a longer genealogy of Shi'i thought, the jurisprudential debates that shaped it, and the political transformation that brought us to the present moment. I will draw on the materials I presented at Duke and Columbia University earlier this year, the previous year actually, 2025, weaving their historical and conceptual textures into the core arguments of your SFU text here. The result, I hope, will be a layered and nuanced account, crisp in language, but rich in depth, firmly academic, but accessible to those less familiar with the intricacies of Islamic intellectual history. Wisdom and Governance is not a manifesto. Ha'eri Yazdi is not writing as a polemicist or a political activist. His critique of guardianship of the jurist is not built on modern liberal premises or exogenous secular criteria. It is a metaphysical critique, a philosophical deconstruction of the very idea of governance as articulated by the Islamic Republic. The force of the book lies precisely in its internal stance. It refuses to place reason and revelation in opposition. Instead, it insists that proper understanding of Islamic metaphysics makes authoritarian clerical rule impossible to sustain. This is what I called at Columbia University a rationalist internal critique, a mode of argument that draws from within the Islamic philosophical tradition to challenge the political theology that the clerical establishment has so confidently claimed as its own. Ha'eri Yazdi is uniquely positioned for this task. Trained in Rome under some of the greatest traditional masters and simultaneously educated in Western analytical philosophy, he occupied a liminal intellectual space. He moves with ease between Ibn Sina and Locke, Mullah Sadra and Kant, and this ability to speak in both idioms gives his critique a distinctive potency. He is able to show that the principles of Islamic metaphysics, properly understood, are fully compatible with the demands of practical reason, constitutionalism, and popular agency. The opening move of the text is therefore diagnostic. Ha'eri identifies what he sees as a decisive historical inversion, the elevation of fiqh or jurisprudence at the expense of hikmah, philosophy. Jurisprudence, which is concerned with ethical norms and devotional obligations, has been mistaken for a science of the state. The result is a category confusion. Jurists specialize in ethical suasion. Governance requires managing coercive force. To move from one to the other is to conflate fundamentally distinct domains. This conflation is the conceptual foundation of the modern Iranian state. Ha'eri's task is thus to restore the proper domains, wisdom as the ground of political judgment, jurisprudence as the guide for moral behavior, and governance as the expression of collective rationality rather than theological sovereignty. But to fully appreciate this intervention, we must place it within its historical context. And here, the genealogical work undertaken by my Duke talk earlier becomes essential. Shi'i political thought begins with an extraordinary doctrine, the imamat, of course. The imams possess a dual form of authority, spiritual and political, epistemic and charismatic. But with the occultation of the 12th imam in the 9th century of the Twelver community, the Shi'i community was placed in a situation of unprecedented political ambiguity. Without a visible, infallible leader who could claim the right to interpret divine law or lead the community, what were they supposed to do? What unfolded over the next millennium in a complex story of institutional evolution, intellectual contestation, and shifting political alliances. I have traced this evolution in three distinct stages. The first stage emerges under the Safavids, when Twelver Shi'ism became the state religion of Iran in 1501. The clerical establishment entered the machinery of governance. Jurists like Sheikh Ali al-Karaki were granted extraordinary authority, even being declared deputies of the hidden imam. This gave the jurist a political status previously unimaginable. It signaled for the first time a fusion between clerical authority and state coercion. The second stage unfolds under the Qajars. As the central state weakened, the clergy grew increasingly independent. Financial autonomy through religious taxes, close ties with the merchant class, and the transnational prestige of the shrine cities helped produce a class of jurists who functioned as community leaders, arbiters, and de facto moral legislators. The Marja'iyya emerged a decentralized yet powerful network of scholarly authorities whose influence extended far beyond Iran's borders as some of the most influential, as a most influential institution. The third stage culminates in the constitutional revolution, which started in 1906 and continued until 1911. Here, the clerical estate secured something unprecedented: formal constitutional authority. Article 2 of the supplement to the Constitution established a committee of jurists empowered to veto legislation that contradicted Islamic law. In other words, juristic authority was now enshrined as part of the state. Across these phases, the clerical estate moved from advisors to the state, to autonomous socio-economic leaders, to formal constitutional overseers. By the time Khomeini had articulated the theory of Velayat-e Faqih, the scaffolding for clerical political rule was already firmly in place. But this historical ascent was paralleled by an intellectual transformation within Shi'i jurisprudence, one that dramatically expanded the epistemic authority of the jurist. This is the second genealogy necessary for understanding Ha'eri's critique. The Akhbari-Usuli conflict is one of the greatest intellectual dramas of Islamic legal history. As Robert Cleave has shown, this was not a minor scholastic dispute. It was a battle over the nature of knowledge itself, how one can claim certainty about God's law in the absence of the Imam. The Akhbaris insisted on textual certainty. The transmitted reports from the Imams, the Akhbar, were collectively certain and therefore sufficient. Reason, analogy, and juristic inference were seen as innovations threatening the purity of revelation. The Usulis, by contrast, argued that most legal questions were inherently probabilistic after the occultation. Reason was not only useful but indispensable. They developed a sophisticated methodology to manage uncertainty, turning conjectural judgments into binding rules through procedural rigor. This methodological revolution had profound consequences. First, it elevated the jurists from interpreter to epistemic authority. The community now needed a mujtahid to manage the legal doubt. Second, it invested the jurist's reasoned opinion with binding force. The fatwa became the laity's certainty. And third, it constructed a system in which the jurist became the locus of legal agency. The marja was not merely a scholar. He was the community's source of legal stability. The political implications of this shift cannot be overstated. The Usuli victory created a class of indispensable jurists whose interpretive authority now carried moral, social, and eventually political significance. It is precisely this expanded epistemic authority that Khomeini's doctrine transforms into political sovereignty. But it is also this epistemic architecture that Ha'eri Yazdi reinterprets, reclaims, and ultimately subverts. At the conceptual heart of Wisdom and Governance lies a profound philological and philosophical insight. Both Hikmat, wisdom, and Hukumat, governance, derived from the root words of Hakama, meaning judgment. In logic, hukm is the act of prediction, the affirmation or denial that constitutes rational thought. In politics, Ha'eri argues governance should likewise be understood as the adjudication of social claims through reason. This move accomplishes several things simultaneously. First of all, it detaches governance from juridical authority. Secondly, it resituates political power within the domain of practical reason. Then it denies that revelation alone can legitimize coercive authority. And it frames political decision-making as a rational, deliberative process. In this framework, the jurist's expertise in devotional norms gives him no inherent claim to political leadership. His moral counsel may guide individuals, but it cannot command citizens. Governance belongs to a different domain altogether, a domain of consent, accountability, and collective rationality. This is the conceptual foundation for Ha'eri's alternative political model. Against the doctrine of guardianship, Ha'eri offers a constitutional model that draws on Islamic legal concepts but reinterprets them through a modern, or rather contemporary lens. The model rests on two principles. The first one is the joint private ownership, what he calls Malikiyat Musha'. The polity belongs collectively to its citizens who are its natural proprietors. And the agency contract, or what he calls Aqd Wakalat. The government is an agent entrusted by the owners to manage their shared property. It's not their own property. This model has radical implications. The implications are that, first of all, sovereignty resides in the citizenry, not the cleric. Political authority is delegated, not inherited or divinely sanctioned. Legitimacy depends on consent. Authority is revocable. Accountability is intrinsic to the very logic of the state. The brilliance of this model lies in its internalism. It does not import Western liberalism. It retrieves Islamic concepts of agency, contract, and rational obligation. Yet, it arrives at conclusions deeply resonant with modern constitutionalism. Ha'eri's contrast with Rousseau illustrates this point. Whereas Rousseau's general will absorbs individual agency into a collective whole, Ha'eri's model preserves individually within a shared framework. Society is not a whole, it's not a kull. It is a universal, it is a kulli, instantiated across autonomous individuals. The state can never supersede the citizens whose will constitutes it. This is Islamic contract theory reimagined as political theory. Perhaps Ha'eri's most striking argument, and one with profound implications for contemporary Iran, is his insistence on the incompatibility between faith and coercion. Religious obligation in Islamic law are voluntary. The value of worship, repentance, devotion, indeed the very meaning of Islam as submission, depends on intention. Coercion destroys intentionality. It nullifies moral worth and value. This produces a simple but devastating conclusion. A coercive Islamic state is not Islamic. It's that simple. It imposes behavioral conformity while extinguishing the inner freedom that gives religious acts their value. The state's enforcement of piety produces not faith, but fear. Precisely the opposite of what the Sharia demands. In this sense, the Islamic Republic's claim to enforce religiosity is theologically void as well as politically oppressive. We return then to the crisis with which we begin. The violence and authoritarianism unfolding in Iran right now, today, is not simply a political malfunction. It is the logical conclusion of a doctrinal project that fused moral authority with state power and insulated itself from rational scrutiny. Ha'eri Yazdi's work stands as both a critique and a path forward. It offers a way to think politically within the Islamic tradition without submitting to theocracy, a way to integrate metaphysics with constitutionalism, a way to reclaim human agency without severing ties to revelation. But more than anything, it reopens the fundamental questions that authoritarian systems seek to close. What justifies authority? How should law function when infallibility is absent? How do reason and revelation coexist in the domain of politics? What is the moral status of coercive power? Who owns the polity and how is that ownership exercised? Ha'eri refuses to answer these questions by substituting one form of absolutism for another. Instead, he insists on the discipline of reason, the humility of fallibility, and the centrality of human agency. This is the philosophical ground for imagining new Muslim political futures, futures in which wisdom and governance, Hikmat and Hukumat, stand in rational relation rather than theological fusion. So in conclusion, let me close again where I began. The current crisis in Iran exposes the peril of sacralized power. It reminds us that political theology, when armed with coercive force, becomes not a source of moral betterment, but a machinery of harm. In such moments, returning to texts like Hikmat and Hukumat, is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of intellectual responsibility. Ha'eri Yazdi gives us a framework for thinking that does not abandon tradition, but refuses to be imprisoned by it. He shows that the Islamic philosophical tradition, when taken seriously, does not lead to authoritarian guardianship. It leads to shared agency, rational accountability, and the ethical dignity of citizens. If we are to imagine a Muslim politics adequate to the demands of justice, reason, and freedom in our time, we must begin with precisely this kind of philosophical work. Not a rejection of the past, but a rereading of it. Not a secular escape from metaphysics, but a metaphysical grounding for democracy. Not the rule of the jurist, but the governance of the people through reason, deliberation, and wisdom. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Dr. Dariush. I think we can open the floor for questions and queries and reflections and meditations over this very important and profound discussion. And I want to also express my personal gratitude to you for foregrounding what is currently unfolding in Iran. I was sort of at a loss for words as to how to commence with that as a backdrop. But I'm really delighted that you've brought it into the discussion in this really substantial and meaningful way. So, folks, I know we have people who would like to share. I don't have a roving mic, so if you don't mind just speaking up loud.
Yeah. So I really like the formulation, but in terms of, if I kind of look at it on a more civilizational scale, the history, because Iran has had a very unique history to itself, and then there is also the Islamic thought there, and it has a very particular, qualities to it. So, and that has pre-Islamic, I guess, some structures also into it. So that thought that those structures must be in the Islamic variety also, and also in a secular sense also. So within Iran, is it, or like how do those strains see what has happened? So one is like the particular very Iranian view of Islam, and then also the civilizational stream going into a more secular kind of direction. Because what I see is that in the population there is a diversity of narratives.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to understand.
Okay, so first of all, let me draw your attention that the focus would be primarily on the wisdom and governance, on Dr. Ha'eri's book, but I will add a few points to that one because I think it's important. One of the things that we must not forget is that the theory, which is the foundation of the current political regime in Iran, did not exist in this form at all before the Qajar period. It's actually with Mullah Ahmad al-Araghi, and this is what Ha'eri discusses in the book when he looks at the argument that Mullah Ahmad al-Araghi at the time of Fath al-Shah Qajar offers in his Awa'id al-Ayyam to make a case for the Velayat-e Faqih. And it is a novel phenomenon. It is something that even within the Shi'i community, even within the Shi'i interpretations of Islam, is unprecedented. And it is not just unprecedented, it has caused a great deal of discomfort inside the Shi'i leadership. And the reason I mention this is that there is a letter that the late Professor Ha'eri had written to Ayatollah Khomeini just before the revolution. This has not come out yet, it will soon be published, I think. Dr. Ha'eri knows this. So this is just a few months before the revolution. So Khomeini is not yet in Iran. He writes a letter to him with utmost respect because Khomeini is a philosophy teacher as well. And he expresses his concerns about the direction that this theory is going. And he puts it in simple terms that, look, the people who are actually putting this state into action are completely clueless about philosophy, about Islamic ethics, about what's going on in the world. And so you're just opening the Pandora's box, and it's going to be devastating for everybody. The response that Khomeini writes is not a philosophical response, it's not a logical response. You see a very angry response, a very arrogant response from a teacher to a student who has dared to defy the position of his teacher. And he said, you know what, I don't expect anybody to listen to me people among our own ranks disagree with me. But my hope is this, and he actually goes back to the populace. People will listen to me. And that's exactly what is being repeated again and again and again. We are easily falling for the trap of populism, because you convince a large enough number of people that a particular idea is true, is absolute truth and nothing but the truth, and then people buy it, and then that leads itself to authoritarianism. Then you pave the way for dictatorship. That is something we've seen on too many occasions. Now it is repeating itself again and again. So going back to what happened, remember this, when Ha'eri was writing this letter to Khomeini in 1978, this is just before the revolution, 1978, Azar 57, just before the revolution. This is not 1979 yet. This is not like Mustafa Rahimi's letter to Khomeini saying that this Islamic Republic is problematic. This is just before it. He had envisaged what is going on, what is going to happen, long before it. So the civilizational aspect of it is, of course, there, because remember what is happening right now in Iran in combating that kind of autocracy is coming from within the Iranian civilization. The Iranian civilization, I don't mean the Iranian civilization of the past 50 years or 100 years. We have got a long trajectory of different traditions among philosophers, among theologians, among Sufis, among poets, among literary figures who have resisted this. I mean, this is a civilization that produced people like Rumi, like Attar, like Hafiz, like Sa'di, and all the people who have produced the genre of the so-called Nasihatul Muluk, that always constantly advise the rulers to mind their behavior, to not steer away from justice. That is something which is revealing, it's unfolding itself. I think the most recent example of how that civilizational force resisted this tyranny was what we saw in the Women Life Freedom movement, which was the exercise of the agency of women in society. And of course, they've taken something back. But again, forces from inside and outside Iran come to claim it, reclaim it, appropriate it, and move it and steer it in different directions. But it seems that whatever happens, that civilizational approach seems to be coming back. At this moment, I don't see how it is going to play out, because to be quite honest about this, I'm very much concerned, because if Iran really survives this, it would be a miracle. If we can manage to get through this with less bloodshed. Already we've got a huge massacre going on in Iran, but we don't see what is going to happen, because we've seen what has happened in the region, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Lebanon even. This is the same template repeating itself again and again. The only thing which could save us is again wisdom. But how many people listen to wisdom? Khomeini, who was a philosopher, did not listen to his student, who was a great philosopher. And the generation around Khomeini just easily dismissed it. And we see 47 years of tyranny. We are in that decisive moment. Which road are we going to take? It's very difficult to envisage where it's going to go.
I have a few questions. I haven't read the book, so I don't know exactly the arguments mentioned. But I have a few questions about how you mentioned it provides kind of rational critiques to Velayat-e Faqih, right?
Yeah.
So the first question is how this is different from the classical Sunni critiques, like you find the Juwayni and
classical Sunni critiques.
Yeah, you find since Al-Juwayni in the 4th century or something, you find he provides these critiques to Al-Imamiyya and so that's the first question. So
Okay.
And then maybe I can follow up.
You want me to respond to that one now?
Yeah.
So first of all, the classical Sunni critique is irrelevant, because at that time the Isnad Shari community does not at all believe in this governance of the jurist. Up until the time of Khomeini, we should basically trace it all the back before the Safavids, because Juwayni is much long before the Safavids. You're talking about classical medieval times. At that time, the Twelver community believed that not the jurist, nobody is entitled to rule, to have governance. It would be illegitimate. Anybody who possessed political power would be illegitimate, because the only legitimate power would be the imam of the time, and that imam of the time is not there, and nobody knows when he will show up. So de facto, every political leadership in their perspective was illegitimate. Therefore, they don't condone to anything. So if there is a critique, it's a critique of any other political leader at that time, very generically. What Khomeini did, he subverted the whole thing. He said, you know what, I am, to the point, you see, when the Velayat-e Faqih became the representative and the deputy of the Imam, this is one of the common things that we heard at the beginning of the revolution, that Khomeini was called the Na'ib al-Imam, the deputy of the Imam. To the point that many people, even at the beginning of the, come out and declare yourself as the Imam of the time. Many people actually did it, because they saw a momentous victory in what had happened in their Shi'a history. The issue was that this whole change, this evolution, was completely unprecedented. So it's not comparable, because if Juwayni had lived in our times, what kind of language would he use? He would use the language of people like Al-Afghani, like Rashid Reza, like Muhammad Abdo, like all the reformists in the Sunni world who would look at democracy in a different way, not the language of Juwayni. And these people didn't have the opportunity to engage with it. Remember that all these reformists in the Muslim world were already dead by the time that Khomeini was rising to power. When Khomeini was rising to power, before him we had the leftist Islamist movements, and we had people like Ali Shariati who were promoting this idea of a radical revolutionary governance. And of course the one who arrived there was the Jurist, who replaced himself, who replaced the Prophet, who replaced the Imams with the Jurist. So you know what? It's a very simple logic. The 12th Imam, in that perspective, is not going to come out anytime soon. So we've got infinity in front of us. Let's hold it and keep it and not let go of it. And they've done it.
So is the, can I follow up?
Yeah.
I don't want to take much time, but is the problem, like the criticism is about like the epistemic movement from like the Imam who's absent, right, to the representative of the Imam, and then you have the Jurist who's taking this epistemic authority interpretations, or is the problem, I think, like because like the classical Sunni critique is the idea of the unification of epistemic authority in a person in general is the idea, right?
Yeah.
Because you have like this, in jurisprudence you have the madhahib, and then you have the mujtahidun, and then you operate within this epistemic framework of fallibility, right? And then you can make mistakes. And it's very limited maybe in theology, but to the basics, but you can have all of this diversity. Yeah, which is not in the Shi'a tradition, so the critique was going like this. So my question is, what you're saying is basically it's about the shift, not the origin of the problem, right? It's about the movement from the, So my question is whether the criticism in the first direction or in the second direction?
I think it's about the epistemic shift. It's basically that.
The epistemic shift?
Yeah.
Okay, not the first one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, please.
I have a question about Ha'eri's motto, the government as the agency of private owners.
Yeah.
How is this different from secular government?
It's actually very, very much close to it, but with a minor difference. The difference is that this secularized version, I mean, let's look at the context of it. When you're looking at the Western European narrative, let's put it this way, the European Eurocentric modernity of Europe, you have a very sharp distinction between the church and the state. Ha'eri is not going down that route. He's basically telling you it doesn't matter who's ruling. Even if you're a jurist, I don't have any problem with the jurist ruling, as long as the jurist remembers that he's there only temporarily. You're not there for good. And as long as the jurist, now this jurist, the ruler could be a philosopher. You see this classical Greek idea, the philosopher king who is conscious of all of these things. Does not have ultimate and absolute power, which is why he comes to the idea of the joint public ownership, Malikiyat Umumi Musha, that this state is the shared property of every single person. What the Islamic Republic did is inverted the whole thing. He said, you know what, this state is the exclusive property of the jurist because I inherit this from the Imam. Ha'eri says that is not correct. Any time that you as the political leader make a mistake, and you do make a mistake, because what they have conveniently done is that they've quietly moved aside the element of infallibility. By de facto claiming that they are the representative of the Imam, they are claiming that they are infallible. Again, he draws there, you guys are infallible, you make mistakes. And the only way to correct mistakes is a democratic system in which you can be held accountable. That when the ruled, when the led, come back to you and say, you know what, we no longer want you, you have to step down. And this is precisely the argument that Khomeini used just before the revolution. He said, you know what, even if you're a wonderful person, even if you're a great leader, even if you're an incredible Shah, the people don't want you, you have to step down. But the moment he seized power, he just forgot about the whole thing. He said, you know what, that's not how it's going to work. That's how the shift happened. Right? Make sense?
In liberal democracies in the West, if the people vote for something, then it happens. But in the Muslim world, if there's a democracy and people vote for something that goes against the basic tenets of Islam, does Yazdi have anything to say about those instances?
So I think that is a contested issue, because when you say the basic tenets of Islam, which context are you talking about? Because when we say, first of all, remember, Islam does not have feet, Islam does not have legs, Islam doesn't walk, Islam doesn't talk. What we have is a complex history of Muslim communities around the globe with different cultures, different traditions. So when you talk about Islam manifesting itself in Turkey is fundamentally different from what you see in Iran, from what you see in Pakistan, from what you see in Qatar, from what you see in United Arab Emirates, from what you see in Tunisia, from what you see in Lebanon or Syria. They're not the same. Are they not talking about the same Islamic law, Islamic tenets? No, they're interpreting it in many different ways. Because so what we have here is a pluralism. In that sense, that kind of an Islamic interpretation or reframing of what governance means is comparable to what you see in the Western world in the democracies that we have. Because when we talk about democracy, democracy is not the same everywhere. There's a difference between French democracy, British democracy, German democracy, American democracy, and Canadian democracy. You can see it around yourself. You don't have to really look deep into history. Just look what is going on, what is happening right next to you in your neighboring country. It is a form of democracy. How does that operate? Does that operate like how it operates in Canada? Does that operate how it operates in the United Kingdom or in France? They're fundamentally different models, and they've got different consequences in practice. The same happens with Muslim communities, with the only caveat that we have got a long history of despotism, colonization, and lack of self-determination in many of these countries. There is, interestingly, a very intense debate which happened between Muhammad Arkoun, the late Algerian intellectual, and Bernard Lewis at the Library of Congress. So when the 9/11 happened, Bernard Lewis wrote this book, What Went Wrong? And of course the idea was very much Orientalistic, in the very same sense that Bernard Lewis, as a proponent of the singularity of Western modernity, proposed, and when he wrote his ideas about how the conservative government of the United States should go and conquer Iraq and promote good Muslims versus bad Muslims. And by the way, this is the title of Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, which reveals that perspective. In the argument that Muhammad Arkoun makes against Bernard Lewis, he says that, and he said it very clearly, that this is what comes out of Islam. What you just said, basic tenets is like this. This is what comes out of Islam. And when you leave it to these Muslims, they always do it. When you give the choice to these Muslim people, the consequence is nothing other than violence. The argument that he makes, and of course at some point he loses his temper, you see his voice raising. He says, when did these guys ever had a choice? When did they have self-determination? Look at what's happening to North Africa in the 18th and 19th century. For a very long time they are colonized. They are subjugated. They are destroyed, and that keeps continuing over and over and over again. Freedom, you see, when we talk about responsibility, it has to happen in a free space. When you do not have freedom, when you're constantly subjugated, you cannot make a choice. Self-determination becomes meaningless. And of course, that is what you find in secular democracies, but also you find it in Islam, in a Muslim understanding, the way that Ha'eri would propose it when he talks about the autonomy of reason in conversation, in dialectic with revelation. He's basically telling you that you have a choice. You, the citizens, could at any given moment remove anybody from power. It is not just your right, but it's also your duty. That overlaps with secular democracy, so be it. But he sees it from within the tradition. Are we good?
I want to come out of left field.
Yes.
With an entire, so you ended on a very, very sort of interesting and very compelling point about. Do you mind going back to the very last sentence of your presentation? You identified 3 different parameters through which.
Through reason, deliberation, and wisdom.
Yes.
Yes.
I immediately started thinking about sort of Western modernity and its use of those terms, and sort of Habermas's communicative action and those types of things. And I'm wondering, was there any sort of cognizance? I mean, I haven't read Harvey's manuscript more specifically, but what was it? What was the engagement like with, whether it's jurisprudence or kind of philosophical notions or cosmologies from outside of the tradition, scripture and theology? So,
first of all, when Ha'eri is writing the book, Habermas's theories are not really on the horizon. I mean, they're not, Habermas is there, but Habermas is not really part of the general discourse. Habermas is showing up in the late 80s, early 90s, and then gradually it spreads those ideas. And of course, a lot of other political theories which are there. If you look at the way that Ha'eri is engaging with these things, you see the names of Kant and Rousseau. So basically, you're looking at 18th, 19th century early modern figures. We are not yet with we are not really fully engaged with the devastating consequences of how Eurocentric modernity unfolded itself in the 20th century. Ha'eri is still looking back at the tradition of the early 20th century and mid 20th century, and by the time he passes away, this whole debate is not really unfolding. So that is pretty much absent. What he does is that he tries to revive what he finds in the philosophy of Ibn Sina, in Farabi, in Mullah Sadra, and then bring them into conversation with Kant and Hegel and Rousseau to see how they are interacting with the problem. But if he had lived longer, if the manuscript had seen the light of day at the time when it was written, it could have probably changed things. But here's the good point about Ha'eri's manuscript is that even though they censored the book, they killed the book practically in the Islamic Republic, it has massive influence in seminaries because it was copied and it was circulated extensively among jurists. And of course, it created a lot of debate, and people started attacking him in Friday sermons and writing refutations against him in newspapers, which of course led to the very last part, the last section of the translation you would see is openly responding to 2 figures who are senior clerics in the Islamic Republic. One of them is Abdullah Jawadi Amuli, the other one is Azari Qumi, and he just basically says, you know what, you guys, there's a phrase that he uses them, he calls them mustaz'af aqli. He says, mustaz'af aqli, you're intellectually destitute because you don't know even the basics of philosophy and jurisprudence. And he's absolutely right about this because these guys are primarily aligned with the political power and didn't have anything else to offer. So that you would find in the very last chapter of the book where he openly and in very simple terms, he defies the governance of the jurists in the book. So the short answer is Habermas is not yet on the horizon.
But he is informed by Rousseau and Kant.
He is informed by Rousseau and Kant.
I have another super quick follow-up question about the afterlives of the book. How can the book be read, not by yourself, but by Iranians in this contemporary moment?
I think the most important contribution of the book is that it gives agency to people. It takes agency, it takes authoritarianism from the jurists, from foreign governments, from people in exile, it very openly says that this is a situation which needs to be determined by the people through a democratic process. You cannot export democracy from the United States like you did it in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, or in Iraq. That's not how it's going to operate. If you follow the same model, it's going to fail. When you see the role of the individual citizen in being able to defy them, then that becomes really fundamental. But expanding this is really critical, to really give the agency to the citizen. And in order to do that, you need to prepare the context, the mechanisms for the citizenry to be able to decide. Right now, we are facing something fundamentally more dangerous. We are dealing with the curated information of the social media. The social media is skewing everything. What you hear, what you read, you've got a sense of it. It's horrific. But how much of that is actually true? We are living in a post-fact world. There was an article in Haaretz a few months back about how these social media campaigns that drive certain political oppositions are curated, are invented. And contrary to what they say, they do not actually represent actual will of the people. It magnifies voices. You're in an echo chamber, and everybody is convinced that this is the voice of the people, of the entirety of the people. We don't know that yet. That is something completely unclear, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous, because you don't know what is going to happen next. Yeah. Yes, please.
I was wondering, does Ha'eri Yazdi talk about or consider checks and balances to populism? I know this is more of a philosophical treatise, but does he talk about when the will of the people is harnessed towards electing A government or B government, and when that no longer represents the will of the people, or when the will of the people as a populace kind of goes against their best interest? What does he see? What does he take from the tradition in terms of checks and balances?
Well, the tradition is telling you very, very clearly that a leader is ethically responsible. A leader does not have inherent right to just rule. And he repeats it very often. That is the essential checks and balances. You know, there is one of the things that Ha'eri actually does is to take away one of the key fundamental arguments that the governance of a jurist actually offers. There is this famous tradition which Khomeini and the people before him actually used to legitimize the governance of the jurist. He says, Al-ulama'u warasatul anbiya. The scholars, the jurists, are the inheritors of the Prophet. He says, you've completely misunderstood this. You've just turned this on its head because you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of the Prophet. Your responsibility is knowledge, and knowledge requires you to ask questions, not to demand submission from people, not to demand coercion from people. So you're committing a fallacy in order to fool the people into submission. And that is something which is really at the heart of checks and balances. You ask people questions. You ask the rulers questions. You cannot get away with it. If you do something wrong, you need to be accountable for it. It's that simple. But the issue is, do we have the mechanisms for it? How does a democratic system come into place? The Islamic Republic began with elections and continues with elections, but everybody knows that election is just an empty word now. It has become thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner over time. And it's become very precarious now. So yes, checks and balances are there then. Yes, please.
I just had also, what do you think of the civil-military relations?
The civil-military.
Relations, because how the IRGC, the state structure, because also it has gone under evolution. So how do you see that in the current moment put enormous constraints on the people, what the structure is. And in these difficult situations, ideal expectations are, like you can have particular constraints. So what is the optimal shift which the current situation can process? What do you think would be would it be a rationalist critique? Would it be a counter-populist movement? Where do you feel the current dynamics could be engaged, like optimal kind of shift?
So first of all, your question does not really address the book, because when Ha'eri was writing this whole scenario was really not on the horizon. The IRGC was not relevant in this discussion. Now it is turned into a mafia. And so the comments I make is almost entirely independent of what we see here, but it's grounded in that one. So the optimal situation, or the ideal situation that I think, is the flourishing of civil society. How does civil society flourish? It begins with peace. The first place where you could actually do this is cessation of violence. And this is a maturity that should grow in society. This is something that the state should start acknowledging and realizing that they are not acknowledging yet, and they are resorting to violence. This is something that the people must acknowledge, because the people must know that the path to freedom and justice does not go through gun barrels. It just doesn't work. Whether you pick up arms inside the country, whether somebody brings it from the outside, it is just going to be a very lengthy process. I was talking to my friend who's sitting here about the French experience, that what happens is a Robespierre moment of the French Revolution. And we don't want that to be repeated, but it seems that we are on the brink of it. So the optimal situation is that reason really goes back to people, that they start thinking twice when they are making a radical decision of changing things. Of course, there is no doubt there is a corrupt system going on, politically, financially, economically. It is corrupt. And that corruption is not something which is inside Iran. That corruption is something global. It is in conversation with the global corruption that you see in the world. And people might say, okay, this is something marginal. This is, as Max Weber would describe it, this is Oriental despotism, and then there is Western freedom, etc., etc. Well, we can see what Western freedom is doing. The beginning of the 21st century is the Canadian Prime Minister said it very clearly, is the rupture. I think what Mark Carney said is really a kind of a manifesto of what happens in the 21st century with the legacy of European modernity. 20th century is gone. It's over. The United Nations, the international bodies are becoming increasingly marginal and redundant. I'm not saying they're completely useless, but they are increasingly becoming marginal. So do I have an answer? I'm afraid not. It's very scary. But the fact that I do not have an answer, somebody was actually giving me this example, that this is like the case of COVID, that the guy showed up and said, if you drink bleach, then it's going to kill the COVID virus. And then if you ask him, what solution do you have? And say, I don't have any other solution. Then nobody's going to drink bleach. Guys, everybody knows that it's going to kill you anyways, because there is no other alternative. So we need to really think about those situations. So it's very difficult. I'm afraid there is no easy answer. And I think we should acknowledge that there is really no easy answer. Anybody who comes and gives you, I have got the final solution, is definitely telling you a lie, because it relies on a dogmatism, on a prophecy which is very deceiving, but unfortunately it's like a mirage. Yes?
I'm going to go back to the question of check and balance, because I wasn't satisfied with your answer.
Yes.
And so the question is, going back to the book, to expect a ruler to be ethical seems highly idealistic.
Yes.
And so what pragmatic checks and balances are there for removing a ruler who comes into power and then the polity turns against it or her?
I don't think Ha'eri has yet got the answer to the pragmatic solutions of it, because it is theoretical. It does not at all go into, let's look at the parliament. He talks about parliamentary constitutional power, divisions of power, and at that time, remember this, again, I emphasize this, that Ha'eri Yazdi writes at a point when he is still in the 20th century. He's in Canada. He has seen the benefits of a working, functioning democracy where people could actually go and exercise their agency. And it's ideal. And to some extent, it still works. But does it still work? I'm not sure whether it really operates. Because what we see on the rise, particularly in the Chinese and the Russian forms of governance, is something which is not like what we saw in the 20th century in Western democracy. And I recommend that anybody who's really interested in this to have a look at John Keene's seminal work, Life and Death of Democracy, where he goes into the intricate evolutions of how democracies change, how they evolve, and how they ultimately fail, and how they are on their deathbed. Democracy is really on its deathbed everywhere around the globe. We didn't have to wait for Donald Trump to know this. Before Donald Trump, it had started. The beginning of the 21st century showed it very powerfully, and we are in a very scary situation. All right. Adil, should I hand it over to you? Or should we continue?
I think we have time for maybe one more question if somebody
Sure.
has a strong kind of feeling. I think this is a lot to ponder, and it's one of those sort of opportunities for us to meditate on some of the provocative ideas, and they were provocative from their outset, right? And they continue to be provocative irrespective of the socio-political transformations that are currently unfolding. Maybe what I'll do is ask one last question.
Please.
From my standpoint. You mentioned social media and what happens with the contortion of reality and the impact that this has, that it creates sort of reality. I mean, I don't know if we're living in a post-truth or, post-truth. Nobody knows where we're at any given point. Verification and information and the rise of artificial intelligence and deep fakes. It's just a very peculiar time to be around, and so that is something that would have been very difficult to account for and to prepare for in one's treatise about human agency and governance.
Yep.
And things of that sort. But I'm wondering if there is room in this increasingly polarized atmosphere whereby we do have what appears to be, again, this is from an outsider standpoint, I'm neither Iranian nor am I a scholar of the subject matter, but almost like a battle of cosmologies, right, that's currently unfolding. You described quite succinctly and articulately what is happening to this sort of civilizational struggle and the idea of what Iranian or Persian history looks like, and trying to figure out throughout this kind of lineage or heritage or history where one needs to draw either insight or inspiration or aspiration for this republic, or however one thinks of the Hukumat in that context. And so now we are in a situation where there are kind of fomenting visions for what might be kind of a state, at least conceived outside by certain individuals, collectives, with their own sort of ambitions and ideas and notions. And I'm not, your statement about folks who are exiled was very resonant for me. It does kind of point to the degree of entrenchment and grounding in realities in a particular locale. So I'm curious if this treatise has a place today in an increasingly sort of disjointed and polarized environment where bearings are being redefined, and whether or not it will forever be seen as part and parcel of a particular sort of tradition that might be abandoned whole cloth. I mean, I'm sorry to be putting it in this almost absurdist way, but the things that we're hearing today in social media are so glaringly shocking.
Yes, they are.
That it almost leaves no room for certain things.
It's very nihilistic, yes.
It's very nihilistic. Even the very word Muslim politics is deemed problematic because it has the word Muslim in it.
Yes.
I mean, I'm just being very sort of transparent and blunt about it. So this is my query about: is there room for Mehdi?
The short answer is yes, but let me expand on that one, what I mean by that. There is room for Mehdi Ha'eri's philosophical critique as much as there is room for any other political critique of the current situation, as any other intellectual critique of the current situation. It doesn't matter which world we are living. As far as I'm concerned, I think, until now, AI has not yet developed that kind of function, but that's why I'm just putting a caveat here. human beings still exist, and they are still using their intellect. They are still getting educated. We have still got our children who are growing up. We can instill a sense of social, political responsibility in our children. And teaching people to, and the phrase that I use I think is important, because that's a tradition that I grew up in, my academic tradition, but also in my own community setting, the way that I understand my own tradition. Critical thinking is really important, to be able to apply your intellect to every situation, whether it's in matters of faith, or it's in matters of society or economy. As long as we human beings can apply their intellect, can keep asking questions, and nobody can shut them down, there's probably a hope. But that hope is in chaos. But to tell you my own personal feeling, I see things, I sense things, and my friends would tell me, you're too optimistic, you're too idealistic, or you're too naive to think that things are going to change. I look at my child, the way that she challenges me with basic questions. Has there been a shift? Has there been a mutation in the genes of these children that they are seeing things differently? Part of it is probably because of their education in the modern world, in the contemporary world, and their access to information or social media. The other part is something that we do not envisage, we do not see. Something is going on under the skin of society, and I'm afraid it sounds completely absurdist because it's too generic. It's just like a believer's perspective. I believe, I hope that something will come back. That's why it may sound naive or idealistic. But that's what hope looks like. Hope is really founded on faith.
I will take faith, idealism, and hope over cynical nihilism. So
great.
With that note, thank you so much, Dr. Dariush Muhammad, for
Thank
your
you.
time.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Can I just...
Yes, please, of course.
First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to yourself, Dr. Iskandar, and also to the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies for arranging this event. It was a pleasure for myself and my daughters to have this opportunity to join this event. I also want to express my gratitude to Dr. Muhammad Pur, who did a brilliant job in translating the book, because it was a very hard task. I'm sure that it was a very challenging task to translate this book. But myself and my family are very delighted that the political philosophy of my father, who initiated and he questioned this Islamic Republic of Iran right from before the revolution happened in 1978. And unfortunately, at that time, when he was mentioning all his thoughts and theories, a lot of harsh comments were made against him, and unfavorable articles were written in various media and social media at that time, and continued after that. But anyway, he was always saying that I have thrown a stone in a well, and who knows that when the sound is going to be heard. And I'm glad that after nearly 25 years after he has passed away, now we are sort of seeing his thoughts to be distributed in various academic environments, and the various universities. This book has been published by Springer, and it has been distributed to various universities, and we are very delighted about this, and we hope that the wisdom is the key element to everything else. He voiced for the check and balance, and he was always saying that you can always imagine that a building, you have many residents in the building, and you have common areas. The joint common ownership, this was his thought, that you appoint a committee to run these common areas for the benefits of all the residents. And whenever you feel that they're not doing their job, you have to change them. So this is the basic check and balance that he was thinking about it. Now, it might have a lot of side effects, but we have to see. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.